So we are working through chapter 22, talking about unemployment, and today we're going to start talking more about inflation as well. Yeah. Okay, so just recapping what this chapter was about and what we have looked at so far and what we are going to look at today. We're going to explain why unemployment is a problem, define the unemployment rate, the absorption rate, the labor force participation rate. Talk about trends and cycles in labor market indicators. Explain why unemployment is an imperfect measure of underutilized labor. Explain why unemployment is present even at full employment. Explain how unemployment and real GDP fluctuate together over a business cycle. So that was our unemployment discussion. The second part of this chapter, explain why inflation is a problem. Explain how we measure the price level and the inflation rate. Explain why the CPI measure of inflation might be biased. So, having gone through all these slides, what we did at the end of yesterday's lecture was take a look at some questions. And I said we would start off today by dealing with some more questions. So I just added some questions into the slides here. You can get out a piece of paper and a pen. And we will warm up with a question. Okay, so this is a fairly common kind of question that you will encounter. You've been given a table with some information. You've been told there's a population, working age population of between 15 and 64 years, and you've got a number, there's 20,000. You're told that the unemployment rate is 30%, and you're told that the percentage of this group of people that is not economically active is 25%. You then asked which of these three statements over here is correct. Is the number of employed people 10,500? Is the labor force 15,000? And is the number of unemployed people 6,000? Which of those is or are correct? So if you got your textbook with you, then you can turn to pages 481 and 482, where you've got your equations, if you can't remember what the equations are. You've been given information. You need to work with those equations. Figure out which of those are correct. Any questions at this stage? Okay, can we go through the answers? Yeah? Excellent. Okay, let's start with the easiest one, number 2 over here. Oh, sorry. Number 2. Is the labor force 15,000? You happy with that? Excellent. Okay. Thereafter, having figured out that the labor force is 15,000, is the number of unemployed 6,000? No, what is it? Sorry, 4,500. Okay, so what is the number of employed then? Are we happy with that then? Okay, any issues? Do you all agree with those answers? I don't hear a resounding yes, so I'm not really sure what that means. Can I what? I can do the calculations. Yes, I can. Do you want me to go through them? Okay. So which ones are you having problems with? So you're going to have to talk up because it's... So how did I get the labor force? Okay, well the labor force is the first part that needs to be done for this equation to be calculated. You know that the percentage of not economically active is 25%, and not economically active is the same as saying in your diagram on page 480, not in the labor force. So you know that the percentage that is not in the labor force is 25% of the working age population, because you can see working age population is divided into labor force and not in labor force. So if not in the labor force is 25%, then in the labor force is 75%. So 75% of 20,000 will give you, correct, it will give you 15,000. Now you've got labor force, you've got some other percentages. I would argue it's pretty straightforward to then do the other two calculations. Yeah? Okay, cool. Okay, any other concerns? Okay. One more question. Which of the following are correct? And we can just talk about them as we go through them. Number one, structural unemployment is present at the natural rate of unemployment. Yes? Okay? Structural is present at the natural. Great. Cyclical unemployment is present at the natural rate of unemployment. No. During a peak period in the business cycle, there is no unemployment, and the natural rate of unemployment is 0. It's very unlikely that that would be the case. Number 4, during a recessionary period, the unemployment rate increases, and so does the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, let's look at the first part. During a recession, the unemployment rate increases. Yes? And what about the natural rate of unemployment? No, remember the natural rate of unemployment is the unemployment rate associated with full employment or with potential GDP. Okay? In other words, when we're not in a recession usually you would be in a recession below full employment, but when you're not in a recession below full employment or in an expansion above full employment. Okay? So natural rate of unemployment is when we are at full employment. You could be in a recession and be above full employment. Usually you would be in a recession and going below full employment. Either way, during a recession period, it does not change the rate, the natural rate, of unemployment. Okay? So what have we got? Option 1. Okay, so option A, 1 only is correct. Any questions? Anything you want clarity on? Yes.
For the first option,
yes.
With natural unemployment, isn't it structural and frictional?
Correct. It is both of those. At the natural rate of unemployment, we will have both structural and frictional unemployment. Correct. So number 1 asks, structural unemployment is present at the natural rate. So yes, structural is, so is frictional. Okay? Okay, anything else? No? All right. So moving on to the CPI and discussions about inflation. Okay, so let's first distinguish between the price level and a change in the price level. So the price level is the average level of prices. The price level also gives us some indication of the value of money. When we refer to inflation, what we mean is a persistently rising price level. In other words, a price level that is continuously changing in a positive direction. It is continuously getting bigger. If your price level is continuously getting bigger, then we have inflation. Deflation, on the other hand, would be a price level that is continuously falling. Okay? So we can have a rising rate of inflation and we can have a falling rate of inflation. And both of those mean that the price level itself is rising. Okay? So a rising level of inflation would mean that prices are increasing continuously at a faster and faster rate. That would be a rising level of inflation. A falling level of inflation would mean that prices are increasing but at a slower rate. Right? So if the rate of inflation in South Africa at the moment is around 5.6%, I think, and next month it falls to around 5%, that does not mean that the price level is not rising. It just means that the price level is rising at a slower rate. You get the distinction? Okay. So a rising and falling level of inflation is not the same as a rising and falling price level. And deflation is falling prices. So a falling level of inflation is not the same as deflation. Deflation is when prices are actually going down. Okay. Why are inflation and deflation problems? Well, slow, steady, and anticipated inflation or deflation are not usually considered to be a problem. So if South Africa has relatively stable inflation around 5.5%, that tends to be fine. Okay? The US historically has had inflation that sits at around 2%. For the last couple of years, inflation has been more in the region of about 0.5%. Okay? It's low and it's stable. But an unexpected burst of inflation or a period of deflation brings big problems. Okay? So it's only when your inflation rate changes suddenly or if it's changing rapidly that it becomes a problem. Okay? So especially periods of things like hyperinflation. That's when the inflation rate is increasing at a very, very fast rate. Okay? Then we have a problem. Then that leads to instability. So, there's also this idea of anticipated inflation. If it's anticipated, it's not a problem. If it's not anticipated, it becomes a problem. And we will revisit this issue much later in the course once again. And for those of you that are here for joining our course for, let's say, not the first time, then you should also have some bells ringing somewhere, some cogs turning, some spider webs breaking about the idea that anticipated inflation is not what we're worried about. What we worry about is unanticipated or unexpected inflation. So, what happens when we have unexpected inflation? Firstly, it redistributes income. I'll come back to that in a moment. Secondly, it redistributes wealth. Thirdly, it lowers real GDP and employment. Fourthly, it diverts resources from production. So let's go back to the first one. It redistributes income. An unexpected burst of inflation raises prices, but does not immediately raise wages. Workers are worse off because they can buy less, and employers are better off because their profits rise. Which is an interesting point in the current political discourse of our country at the moment, because the primary mandate of the South African Reserve Bank is to control inflation, ensure that inflation is kept stable and at between 3 and 6% is the goal. Okay? One of the reasons that it's important, of course, if it's not stable, one of the things that happens is it redistributes income away from workers, right? So if we're going to talk about the political message that comes through loud and clear from organizations such as COSATU, who are affiliated with the governing party, workers are supposed to be a big focus of any policy development that happens, right? There has to be a focus that says workers need to be let's say, not looked after, but basically we can't be screwing the workers for the business owners, right? That's the political message. Okay? We then have the public protector, Mkhwebane, coming along and out of the blue making a ruling to say the Reserve Bank needs to change its mandate. It should no longer be focusing on inflation. So if you try and understand the political machinations of what is going on behind the scenes, when you hear something like that out of the blue popping up, you have to wonder, where is the connect, right? Where is this coming from? Why is this now in the political discourse? It makes one wonder. Okay, so it redistributes income. When there are unexpected periods of deflation, well, that's okay. Wage rates do not fall, but prices do fall, in which case workers would be better off because their fixed wages buy more than, and employers are worse off. So inflation would be a redistribution towards employers. Deflation would be redistribution towards workers. If you don't keep a tight control over inflation, you don't tend to have deflation, put it that way. You tend to have inflation. Okay? Secondly, it redistributes wealth. When a loan is taken out and an unexpected burst of inflation occurs, borrowers win and lenders lose. How is that the case? Well, when you take out a loan, you will repay that loan in a future period. Okay? So if I borrow 100 Rand today and I agree to pay back 110 Rand in 1 year's time, 110 Rand in 1 year's time, if in 1 year's time, with an inflation rate of, say, 20%, when I repay that 110 Rand, the purchasing power of that 110 Rand will be less than the original 100 Rand was. You get it? So when a loan is taken out and there's an unexpected burst of inflation, those that are the borrowers tend to win because they repay with money that has a much lower value. It's interesting. Number 3, it also lowers GDP. Let's just get through this point. With an unexpected deflation, obviously the opposite occurs. The borrower loses and lenders win. Okay? Number 3, it lowers real GDP and employment. Unexpected inflation temporarily brings a rise in investment and a boom in production and employment. That sounds good. But what happens afterwards? Profitable investment dries up, spending falls, real GDP falls below potential GDP, and unemployment ultimately rises. Okay, so there's a lot in that statement, and we will look at the models that suggest that this is the outcome. Okay, so we're going to look at diagrams and theory that suggests this is what's going to happen when you have unexpected inflation. Okay? Obviously, with an unexpected deflation, the opposite occurs. And number 4, it diverts resources from production. And this is the real worrying issue when it comes to inflation. When you have unpredictable inflation or deflation, what that does is it turns the economy essentially into a casino. And it diverts resources from productive activities into forecasting inflation. In other words, instead of people taking resources and investing them in productive capacity, instead what people do is they try and predict what's going to happen to inflation and use short-term financial investments to try and basically make a quick buck, right? So it's kind of like gambling on what the economy is going to do through inflation. And at its worst, inflation becomes hyperinflation, and the example is our northern neighbor in Zimbabwe, although they are obviously not the only example of hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is a pretty common occurrence when you have very poorly managed monetary policy. Right. We're going to now introduce something called the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. What is the CPI? It's a measure of the average of the prices paid by consumers Urban consumers, well, in South Africa, it's not really only urban consumers, it's actually most consumers, so I'm not sure why it's got a focus on urban here. But it's the prices paid by consumers for a fixed basket of consumer goods and services. The CPI essentially tells you about the value of money in your pocket. Reading the CPI numbers, well, the CPI is defined to be equal to 100 in a period called the reference base period, also called the base year. Okay? So all of this is a little bit abstract at the moment, and we'll take a look at what this means practically. Okay? First of all, how do we construct the CPI? Well, we select a CPI basket, and this basket contains the goods and services represented in the index, and each is weighted by its relative importance. How do they gather that information? Well, they conduct a monthly price survey. So each month, Stats SA checks the prices of over 400 goods and services in the CPI basket across the country. Okay? So that's how they gather that information. So how do you calculate the CPI? The first thing you do is you find the cost of the basket, and you find the cost in whatever you are going to choose to be your base year period. Then you find the costs of that same basket at prices in the current period or any other period other than your base year period. And you can calculate the CPI for the base period and then for any current period or prior period to the base year as well. So what does our CPI look like? Here's CPI, it's an index. It's the cost of your basket at current prices divided by the cost of that basket in the base year. And then you multiply it by 100. So obviously in your base year, what would your CPI value be? Well, it would be the cost of the CPI basket in the base year divided by the cost of the CPI basket in the base year times 100. So what would your CPI value be in your base year? CPI is 100 in the base year. Because our equation divides the value of the basket in any particular year divided by the base year. So if we want to know the value of the CPI in the base year, we just divide the value of the basket by itself. We're going to end with the value of? We're going to end with the value of 100. 1, the value of the basket divided by itself would be 1 times 100. Okay? Why is the CPI useful? Well, we use it to calculate the inflation rate. How do we calculate the inflation rate? It's the CPI in whichever year we are interested in, right? So in our current year, for example, minus the CPI in the previous year, divided by the CPI in the previous year, multiplied by 100. You can see that this is obviously the percentage, a growth percentage calculation. This is growth percentage equals new minus old divided by old. Change in prices, percentage growth in prices. That's what the inflation rate is. It is the percentage change in prices. So what is the CPI? A CPI is an average measure of prices in a particular year. Right? So what is inflation? It's the average prices in the new year divided by average prices in the old year divided by average prices in the old year gives you percentage change in prices. Okay. So let's look at an example. If you've got a piece of paper and a pen, let's work through this together. So remember, here's our CPI equation. Okay? Here's the information we've been given. The CPI basket consists of oranges and haircuts. Okay? 1, 2. There are only 2 items in our CPI basket. There are a lot more in reality. And we're going to take the base period as being 2012. Okay? So the quantity of oranges in 2012 is 10. Quantity of oranges sold, sorry. And the quantity of haircuts sold in 2012 is 5. The price of oranges was 1. The price of haircuts was 30. Therefore, the cost of our CPI basket is going to be 10 times 1 equals 10. And haircuts, 5 times 30 equals 150. Therefore, the cost of the CPI basket in the base period is 160. Okay. Now we do the same calculation to work out the cost of the CPI basket in 2013. Okay? 2013, the same basket of goods, but we have different prices. We end up with a different value for our CPI basket. Okay? So, first question, what is the value of CPI? What is the value of the Consumer Price Index in 2012? The value of the cost of the CPI basket, is 160, correct? But what is the value of CPI? What is the actual Consumer Price Index value? Not the cost of the basket, the value of the index. It's 100. Exactly. 2012 is our base period. So how do we calculate the CPI? What is the CPI? The cost of the basket in whatever year we are interested in, divided by the cost of the basket in the base period, times 100. So what was the cost of the CPI basket in 2012? 160. What was the cost of the CPI basket in our base period? 160. So what is the value of the CPI in 2012? Okay, what is the value of the CPI in 2013? Okay, hint, the answer is already here. Okay, are you happy with that? Right, if you understand these two, then please calculate for me the inflation rate, 2013. Are you guys happy with 37,5? Okay. So obviously the calculation of this particular inflation rate was very easy because we were using last year as the base year, which just had a value of 100. So that calculation was particularly easy. But we can also work out the inflation rate between any 2 years, neither of which has to be the base year. In which case the calculation is, well, just as easy, but take a little bit longer to calculate. Okay? So we use the CPI as a measure of inflation. However, that measure of inflation is potentially biased. And what are the main sources of bias in that CPI? Well, first of all, there's something called the good news bias. That sounds okay. If you want to compare the price level in 2013 with that in 1969, you must compare the price of a computer today with that of a typewriter in 1969 as a sort of kind of equivalent. Which is to say the newer, more expensive items put an upward bias on CPI and its inflation rate, right? So our products change, right? And that affects CPI. So we're not really comparing, if we're comparing CPI in 2013 to CPI in 1969, we're not really comparing the same kind of products. We've probably got better products today, right? So that's a source of bias. It doesn't tell us about the fact that really we're not buying the same goods that we used to be buying, okay? And the kind of goods that we're buying now are probably just better goods than we bought before. And when I say better, I don't mean necessarily that their quality is better, because I could be comparing the same goods over time that have different quality. And what I'm referring to in the first one is actually different types of goods. Okay? So quality bias as well. Cars, CD players, etc. get better every year. In other words, a car that you're buying in 2013 is probably much better than a car you were buying in 1969, even though they were both cars. Right? So even though the price of those cars has changed, it doesn't tell us about the fact that, yes, but we're not really buying the same kind of cars that we were buying, right? Not only are the goods that we're buying different, but also the quality of those goods, if they are the same, is totally different. There's also something called a substitution bias. In other words, changes in relative prices lead consumers to change the items that they buy. Okay? So what tends to happen, for example, is if they're random and basic example, I guess, if people generally buy tea and coffee, and they're kind of happy to substitute between the two of them, when the price of coffee jumps because, you know, there's a problem with cocoa bean harvests up, you know, Senegal or wherever they farm that stuff, the price of coffee shoots up, then people go, well, hang on a minute, coffee's a bit expensive. What I'm just going to do is buy more tea. Okay? But that's not immediately reflected in your CPI basket. So the CPI basket says, oh, look, the price of coffee has gone up massively, therefore, we've had massive inflation. But it doesn't account for the fact that because the price of coffee has gone up massively, people are now buying less coffee and instead buying more tea. Okay? So when there's a substitution, because of relative price changes, the CPI doesn't tell us anything about that either. Okay? And in fact, there's something that I'll get to at the moment that's not on the slide. Let's just remember. The other is an outlet substitution bias. In other words, when confronted with higher prices, people use discount stores more frequently and convenience stores less frequently. Those are kind of like US terms, I guess. But essentially what it's saying is, Stats SA measures prices across multiple different types of retail outlets, right? But if prices start increasing, and for example, you know, Woolies starts increasing their prices, what do? You know, you're like, okay, maybe I won't be pushing the black trolley this month. I'm going to be, you know, heading over to Checkers and doing more of my shopping there. Okay? Stats SA has no measure of that. Okay? And so the CPI doesn't properly account for that change in outlets. And a related point is, of course, we have an average basket of what people consume. But people that are living in Alexander are unlikely to be are unlikely to be buying what the people in Bryanston are buying. Right? So when the prices in that basket change, it affects those different demographics of people differently. And the CPI does not account for that. So what you will often hear discussions about, if you ever pay attention to any of these things on the radio, is discussions about inflation and how, for example, inflation has been around 7% for the last, let's say, 5 years. But food inflation has been more in the region of about 25%. So if the majority of your budget goes to food, the inflation that you experience, the lived experience of inflation for you, is more like 25% inflation. And if your wage is set in terms of CPI and increases by 7% each year, and the majority of the things you buy in your basket of goods are increasing by 25%, your real wage, the purchasing power of your salary, is going down, right? You're buying less and less. So when you have strikes and you have workers in industries that receive, you know, pretty low salaries, wanting 13% salary increases, the argument is, well, this is 13% versus a real lived inflation of like 20%. So to come to the bargaining table with a 6% offer is ludicrous, is the argument. Okay. Any questions at this point? No? What are the consequences of this sort of a bias? Well, obviously it's going to distort private contracts. What do we mean by distort private contracts? Well, the kind of contracts that you sign on a frequent basis are things like wage contracts. Okay? So if you sign your wage contract expecting prices to increase by 7%, whereas prices actually increase by 20%, suddenly you're working for less than what you thought you were going to be working for in real terms. That is a distortion of your contract. You went into the contract thinking one thing, the reality is something different. It also increases any government spending. Outlay is another word for outlays is spending, right? Obviously, with an increase in inflation, it means that government spending is going to have to increase to deliver the same quantity of real goods and services, right? The nominal value of government spending will have to increase to achieve the same level of real service delivery. Many private agreements, such as wage contracts, are in fact linked to the CPI. So when inflation is not stable, your CPI is all over the place, it's difficult to set wage contracts because no one really knows what to expect in the future. The CPI, of course, is only one of the many price indexes, and there are a couple of alternatives. There's the personal consumption expenditure deflator, and there's the GDP deflator. And if you take a look in your textbook, you'll see what the primary differences are between the GDP deflator and CPI, as well as personal consumption deflator and CPI. Okay? It's relatively straightforward. So when we measure inflation based on the CPI. And of course, that number may vary from month to month or from quarter to quarter. And so to determine the trend in the inflation rate, what we tend to do is strip out the raw numbers of the volatility. So when you see measures of inflation, what you tend to see is there will be, for example, Stats will say, inflation for the first quarter of this year was 5.6%. Then but at the end of the year, they might revise their data and say, actually, it was only 5.4%. Or actually, it was really 5.8%. Okay? So over time, what will happen is there will be adjustments for volatility that was not accounted for in the original estimates. And that brings us to the end of a discussion on CPI. And so here's a question for you. I'll make it a bit bigger. Okay, piece of paper and a pen. You are going to do a calculation. Okay, suppose that in the base period, there's a student who buys 20 liters of petrol at 10 Rand per liter. Okay? So we've got 20 liters, 10 Rand. As well as 2 CDs for 130 each. 4 movie tickets for 28 Rand each. In the next month, the price of petrol has changed. The price of petrol is now 11 Rand 25. Yeah, you can tell this question was set a while ago. And CDs cost 125. Price of movie tickets is now 30. What is the change in the value of the basket of goods and services that this student buys? The assumption here is obviously that the basket has remained the same. So. Okay, what do you guys think? Are you happy with an answer of 4%? Yeah? Well, it is 11, so we can... Whoa. It is 11 o'clock, so we can take a break now. We'll take a quick 10 minutes. Continue working on it if you want to, and if you've got any questions, come and ask me as well.